Good day. My name is Brett Smith. I'm Director of Technology at the Center for Automotive Research in Ann Arbor, Michigan. A moment of background on myself and the Center for Automotive Research. I have been with the organization 33 years, a long time. As in that time period, I've spent much of the last 20 years studying and working on advanced propulsion technologies, strategy, and policy. The Center for Automotive Research is a not-for-profit research organization, again, located in Ann Arbor, Michigan, near Detroit. We are an independent research group that studies the automotive industry and takes those learnings and those findings and presents them to groups like yourself. Again, my background, many years in the propulsion side, but also quite a bit of time on the materials and the structure of the automotive industry. Today, I would like to talk about battery electric vehicles in the United States market. And to do that, I think it's worth starting with policy. The United States, for all the time I've been involved, 33 plus years, has struggled with a way forward for the technology of the automobile. For example, the pendulum swings back and forth. During the Trump administration, one of the first things then President Trump offered was that he would immediately leave the Paris Agreement. In fact, in order to fulfill my solemn duty to protect America and its citizens, the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. He said that back on June 1st, 2017. So after the Obama administration and others joined the Paris Accord, you see the U.S. swing back to pulling out of the Paris Accord. Now, a curious part to this is that he said this on June 1st, 2017, but by law, he could not pull out until this November 4th, 2020, the day of the next election. So the U.S. was in a Paris Accord, the president took us out. Then president, at the time, presidential candidate, about to be president-elect and soon to be President Biden, said on November 4th, the day, remember, that the former president announced we were coming out or the action took place. He then announced today the Trump administration officially left the Paris Climate Agreement. And in exactly 77 days, the day that Biden would be inaugurated, a Biden administration will rejoin it. I show this to remind people, especially from outside of the U.S., how much this policy swings back and forth. Over the decades, it has swung back and forth and back and forth. And we see it moving more and more towards fuel efficiency and lower GHG, but it still can swing back and forth. To show a little bit of that swing, I have some points in time as a reference going back to the Obama administration in the blue up on the top, and then to the Trump administration, where you see the Obama administration putting fuel economy and greenhouse gas regulation into place. And then as soon as we have a new president, you see that president start to take apart those fuel economy regulations. During the Trump administration, for those 4 years, instead of a Democratic president or a Democratic Senate or Congress, instead we had other stakeholders pushing for greater fuel economy. And the most important of those pushing was the state of California. So you still see on the bottom actions taken by the Trump administration. On the top in purple, you see actions taken by others to kind of fight the Trump administration and push for further or more strict greenhouse gas regulations. So finally, the Trump administration is replaced at the end of 2020, actually beginning of 2021, and we go back to seeing what the Democratic candidates will do, or the Democratic president will do. And they basically then spend the first 6 months of President Biden, of his presidency, undoing the things that the previous president had been undoing about the previous president. think about business planning in that world. It's very challenging. Maybe it's getting easier, and I'll come back to that. But this swaying back and forth has always been one of the great American opportunities and one of the great American tragedies, is we don't get good long-term planning. We get 4-year planning, 4 years, the length of a president. In fact, we probably get 2 years of planning because that's how long a president has before they really start worrying about the next election. So we have a very short time period to swing back and forth and back and forth. And now throw on top of that another dynamic where the state of California has the right, again, it was taken away by the Trump administration, but they now have the right to set their own vehicle emissions regulations. So you can have California regulation, you can have a Republican set regulation as we did through the Trump years, or you could have a Democratic president set regulation as we have now with the Obama administration going forward. That's a lot of complexity. And other states can have different emission standards as long as they adopt California's. So you see these other states that are highlighted as states that have agreed with California's zero emissions vehicle regulations and said, we want to implement those or some portion of those. What I describe here is a really challenging market in a lot of ways. So President Biden has come into office with an enormous amount of enthusiasm to make the world a better place, to make the environment better. It is not going to be easy, but he's moving that direction. He's rejoined the Paris Accord. He's given California back its rights to make their own regulations. So he's rescinded the revocation of the waiver, which in easy terms means California can make the rules again. He's also, this month, sometime in the next couple of weeks, setting new fuel economy standards for 2021, yes, 2021 through 2025. And then he'll start the process of looking at beyond 2025, so it'll be 26 through 30 and beyond, setting that regulation. Now, the president has also very strongly urged funding for 500,000 charging stations, incentives for fleets and commercial vehicles, and technology investments for the supply side, getting the vehicle manufacturers and suppliers incentives to make these vehicles. So the Biden administration has started to put this in place, but remember, these are not set yet. And there's a lot of discussion happening in Congress, in the US Congress, that will determine whether or not these bills get passed. It's getting less likely as we go forward. There'll likely be something, but maybe not what you first heard the president talk about. That's part of how this system works. You bargain, you negotiate. But in the meantime, we're left to wonder. One of the things I think that's very useful and worth looking into is what the president has guided his administration to do. And that is look at a blueprint for important technologies or sectors. One of those blueprints is for lithium-ion batteries. The United States Department of Energy labs have been very good over the decades of creating new technologies in the battery world. We have not been very good at putting those into production and commercializing them. So we're left with an industry that is not very thorough, very deep, very complete. And the president understands that if we're going to make electric vehicles, we are going to have to, as a country, figure out how to get that value stream for batteries, the most fundamentally important part of electric vehicles, in place in this country. So as you look at their vision of this, upstream is the mining and contraction, midstream is the processing, downstream is the pack manufacturing and end of life recycling and reuse. There are not fully developed systems in this country for any of those parts of the business. The challenge for this administration is to develop those, with the realization that mining and extraction is going to take a long time because of environmental requirements in this country. So we will be looking for that material from others, and I think the president has used from friendly sources over the next several years as we start to develop it in our country. We are also looking then, as we go through this, to start material processing and cell manufacturing. All of these are things that this country is working on. They have to work within the realm of the technology. They also have to work within the realm of a lot of trade agreements. So sometimes it's not as easy to say, this is what we need to do, we're going to do it, because there's a lot of trade barriers and a lot of other barriers. So as you look at this blueprint, it's a good starting point. It's something probably that we could have done a long time ago. Good for the president to do it, but the reality is the devil is in the detail. The challenge is making it work. And then I'm going to come back to this in a few moments, but what happens to policy if technology trumps policy? And by that I mean if technology advances so rapidly that the policy may not matter. This is President Biden at the Ford Dearborn truck assembly plant. You can see the outlines of the Ford F-150 pickup trucks in the background. Looking at companies from Tesla to Ford to General Motors, bringing out new technology, battery electric vehicles, that may really change our discussion about how we think about electric vehicles. So let's talk for a few moments about electrification in the United States. And I'll bounce back and forth at times between talking about electrified hybrids, plug-ins, and batteries, and just battery electric vehicles. But let's start with a little look back and maybe where we are now. The U.S. market share, this is United States, not North America, just the U.S. But it's really intriguing, I think, to start with what is selling in this country. Because if you can figure out what's selling and you can electrify that, then you got something. What's remarkable about this is in the last 20 years, CUV, cross-utility vehicles, have gone from being a small portion, 1 or 2% of the market, to being 41.5% of the market. Almost half of the vehicles we sell in this country are crossover utility vehicles. Another 17.5% are pickup trucks. If you're going to make electric vehicles that people want to buy in this country, you're going to have to figure out those two segments. I have highlighted the electrified. An electrified segment includes all vehicles that are hybrids, that are plug-in hybrids, or that are battery electrics. 8% of the cars sold through May, or the vehicles sold through May, are electrified. Come back in a moment and look more closely at that. But that's a real big bump up from before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we were struggling around 4.3%. It's double that in a couple of years. That's a big thing to take note of. And in fact, this way, if you look at this year-to-date change this year compared to last year, last year was a difficult market, but we're just looking at the percentages in the market, not necessarily influenced by volume. Electrified sales are up 156.6% in this country. Yes, you started with a small percentage, so your base number is pretty small, which makes this big percentage not a huge volume leap, but it is really obvious and really important to look at the speed at which electrified vehicles are being sold in this country, or that rate of growth. What we have here is a 20-plus year history of electrified. And again, we'll talk electrified as hybrids, the bright green, plug-in hybrids, that blue, and then the darker blue or black is battery electric vehicles. And you can see this year, even compared to last year, the difference in the percent of market share these vehicles are taking in this country. Hybrids, which historically had a high of 4.7, of about 3.2, way back in 2013 are at 4.7% of the market. Toyota has a couple products on the market that are only sold as hybrids, and that doesn't include just the Prius. There are other vehicles that they're selling only as hybrids. Plug-in hybrids are selling more than they ever had, but they're still the lesser of these. But look at battery electric growth from 2018, 19, 20, and 21. That growth rate is absolutely important to look at. Where do we go from here? We don't know. But here's a really neat little exercise that a guy named Glenn Mercer did. Glenn is Automotive Research and Advisory Services. Glenn's one of the great old school auto analysts, one of the best I've ever seen in the business. He went out there and gathered the best forecasts he could find and did a meta-analysis. Okay, what are the companies saying? So 2020, again, battery electric vehicles were around 2%, 2.5%. The forecast for 2025, this group of 14 different forecasts, ranged from a forecast of 5% as a low to a high of 20%. And then by 2030, a low of 8% to a high of 30%. That is up two things. That's a huge range, if you think about this. There's not a lot of consistency or similar expectations. And two, it's if we get anywhere in that high range, it's a really big leap in technology. And I would argue this was done in February. I would argue now if you did this in June, you'd probably see something like this, or maybe even 60% by 2030 of people forecasting it and trying to understand how to get there. Over the last 8 months, we as an organization have spent a lot of time understanding what a ramp up like that would do to the traditional industry and the opportunities it opens for new entrants and others looking to get into this market. But for someone who has watched and tracked and followed this technology since the mid-90s, this is a moment in time that we may not forget in this industry. I come back to what matters to the consumers. U.S. consumers buy a lot of really big trucks that go a long way on gasoline, and they expect a lot out of their vehicle. So the first thing we think about when we think how are we going to get people into electric vehicles is the cost parity. We think it's going to take a battery electric vehicle that is cost competitive with a gasoline car. That doesn't mean it has to cost the same, but it has to be cost competitive. We also think there's a utility parity, that comparison where it has to be as useful, or at least useful in balance. It may do some things better, it may do other things not as well, but that balance has to be there, that utility. A vehicle has to fit the need of them and take them where they want to go and do the things they want to do, even if it's just once a year they want to do it. But that vehicle has to do it, or else they think it's not the vehicle for me. And then there's the convenience parity. Does not require extra time or planning to use. And these are the things for the U.S. consumer we think that are really the important building blocks to growing the segment, or growing the BEV segment. So if we think about the goal of 40% by 2030, these are two products, and you could probably put the Tesla Cybertruck in here as well. But these are two traditional company products that I think are really important. The one on the left is the Ford Lightning, but it's the Ford Lightning for fleets. It's the commercial Ford Lightning. Ford sells a lot of vehicles to fleets, to construction companies. I just today had new windows put in my house. I had 2 Ford pickup trucks from the construction company sitting in my driveway all day. We have to be able to get volume out of that market. On the right is the SUV pickup truck market. Not sure quite what this is. I think this is their their SUV, or I'm sorry, their pickup truck, but it's that high-end luxury truck. The car companies sell a lot of very expensive, very big gasoline Suburbans, Navigators, and other things. That market is a great entry point for battery electric. So on one side, you see Ford with that commercial sector, which is a huge jump forward. On the other side, you see General Motors with a vehicle that is high-end, where we can hide some of the costs, and it's absolutely a gotta-have vehicle for a lot of people. So let's look at investment in electrification at the state and local level for a minute, because I think it tells a really interesting story. Center for Automotive Research for over 20 years has tracked investment by car companies. Investment means money they've said they were going to put into building new plants, putting new equipment in, fixing other plants. Over the last 5-6 years, we've seen a significant increase in the percent of investment that is going into battery electric vehicles. Through 2008, 9, and 10, watching the industry, there was a lot of action and a lot of interest in electric vehicles from the public relations side, but they weren't putting nearly as much money into the engineering side, into the plant side, What we're seeing now is an absolute commitment to put money into battery electric vehicles. This puts it into company by company. And while Tesla has been so successful and has had a great run, it's important to note that General Motors has put $8.7 billion into battery electric plants through May of this year. Ford, $5.3 million. FCA, formerly FCA, now Stellantis, $4.8 billion, That's a lot of investment, and as you go down the list, you see others. The auto industry, the old saying goes, put your money where your mouth is. If you're going to say something, do it with your money. The auto industry is doing it with their money right now. They are saying battery electrics are the future. And these are little heat maps, we call them. It kind of shows you where these products are likely to be. This map is forward-looking, so some of the circles actually may never make it. Others may end up in production a little bit different. But as you can see, for the North American domestics, those companies that are headquartered in the U.S., with the exception of Tesla, a lot of the investment and a lot of the manufacturing is around Detroit, Southeast Michigan, Indiana, Ohio. From the Asian manufacturers so far announced, Geely, Honda, Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi, and Subaru, you can see where those battery electric vehicles will be built. Again, moving a little south, but still quite a bit up in the Midwest, in the Great Lakes region. And then BMW, Daimler, and Volkswagen. So you can see where that is. Again, I mentioned earlier, we've been spending quite a bit of time looking at how this industry is shifting. And it is shifting. It is shifting at a speed that is just, for an old guy like me who's been around, unbelievable. And maybe we'll start with this premise. Battery electric vehicles will require 40% fewer parts. Who will make what? Now, 40% fewer parts is something that people have said frequently, hand-waved, and said this is how much it's going to be. There's not a great study that says this is exactly it, but understand that battery electric vehicles will have fewer parts, and they'll probably be manufactured different. Come back to that part in a moment. But this is a time where the industry is thinking about how they've done things in the past and how they'll do them in the future. Talking about integration, how much of a vehicle a company builds. Tesla is pretty highly integrated. They do a lot of stuff. If you think about it, they have a partnership with Panasonic. They've actually been trying to develop their own batteries, maybe not having as much immediate commercial application as they thought they might, but they're very involved in the battery. They're involved in the cathodes. They even secured rights to 100 or 10,000 acre lithium clay deposit in the U.S. They're owning it coming out of the land. They very much engineer, design, and make a lot of the componentry for their motors and electrical hardware. In fact, they're renowned for it. They are absolutely one of the best in the world right now at this internal development. And of course, they've gone all the way to selling the vehicle straight to the customer and not having a dealership. So they are vertically integrated. They're also very, very cool and very, very wealthy due to their stock price. So other companies look at that and think, maybe we need to do this. I'll argue that GM is a little bit following Tesla's lead. They've branded their batteries, their partnership with LG Chem. They've branded Ultium brand their electric drive motors, and they describe it as a family of flexible motors with integrated power, electronics, and power. And they're trying to sell those to anybody, I should say, to others that would like to buy them. Their first example is they are, in essence, a subcontractor for Honda. They would love to sell others electric drive motors. They, in fact, have deals now to sell hydrogen fuel cells to a train, a locomotive company. They are becoming very much a supplier of these technologies. Again, this design of General Motors will build these things, but they're including casting, gears, and assemblies, sourced globally, but built by General Motors and designed and engineered by General Motors. Volkswagen is also following a very similar path, at least initially. This is a slide they showed several months ago at one of their EV battery electric vehicle days, and they had the hashtag components inside. And I think it's two parts. One is what's inside the vehicle, but also what are the things they're doing internally. And a lot of these are things that might have been done previously by suppliers. So you see this shift in vertical integration. Maybe. Ford, I think, is another great example. And this is from last summer, but it's really great example of how eye-opening this discussion is, even for those at the top. Jim Hackett, who retired in third quarter of last year from from Ford, said the supply chain has ramped up since Elon built his Gigafactory. And so there's plenty there that does not warrant us to migrate our capital into owning our factory. No advantage to ownership in terms of cost or sourcing. He's saying, we don't see a need to get into the battery business or to get into the electric motor business because there's capacity that we can leverage. A couple months later, Jim was gone. Another Jim came in, Jim Farley. And as you read through this, it basically says, you know what? 40% less parts, there's that number again. That means they're a lot easier to put together. We have to figure out how to do that effectively and read between the lines. And by the way, keep our UAW members employed. So obviously, it makes sense to go into cell production, which just 5 months prior, his predecessors said just the opposite. I think that kind of thinking, that kind of change in mindset is happening daily at these car companies. I want to end on a little bit more technical note, but not get too technical. This picture on the left, the 2002 GM autonomy chassis, was a concept. In fact, I was there when they introduced it at the Detroit Auto Show, or showed it at the Detroit Auto Show. And they basically said, look, with electric vehicles, whether it be a fuel cell or a battery electric vehicle, we can create this cool thing called a skateboard. And we can put anything we want on top of that. Tesla did something very similar for the Model S. Maybe not quite that cool and that stylish. But now you look 20 years later, the GMC Hummer that I showed you earlier is in some ways that skateboard 20 years later and done to make it actually buildable. You see an industry that's going from platforms to skateboards, and maybe there's some other things that are going forward, but we'll come back to maybe thinking about what just this shift to an electric vehicle skateboard strategy might do. And I will argue it enables contract manufacturing. If your skateboard, if that underbody can be made in high volume and then be set up to be a sports car, a mid-size passenger car, or a mid-size CUV, or maybe even a pickup truck, all of that same platform, you have the opportunity to really differentiate that product while getting volume at that skateboard level. I would argue the shift to skateboarding really encourages contract manufacturing opportunities. I'll list some ideas for you here, and I think these are pretty common, but I think it's really good to think about them. First one is actually an automotive manufacturer. General Motors, building BEVs for Honda. They're sort of a contract manufacturer for Honda. And as I said earlier, I think they would like to do that for other companies as well. Then there's the traditional automotive contract manufacturer. Magna has been building cars for other people for a long time. They've announced plans to build BEVs for several brands using, at least in some cases, Magna's own skateboard or Magna's own platform. And then there's, of course, the big one, Foxconn, the computer model, announced plans to build BEVs for several brands over several different continents and several different manufacturing facilities. So the skateboard strategy really changes our industry. And yes, there's this next step of cell to chassis, which will change it more, but I would argue maybe still just plays off the enabling of the skateboard strategy. So I'm here to tell you, after being in the business 30-some years, I can finally say I've never seen change like this, and it is exciting as heck to watch, and it's got to be as exciting as heck to get into it. It's a great opportunity if you're a new technology provider. With that, some takeaways. I will tell you, U.S. policy is shifting fast. It still trails key markets. The Biden administration has embraced BEVs and will support to push their development. California will continue to lead in this regulation. But remember, in a few years, there's another election, and that may change some things. I don't think it'll change the shift to BEVs on a broader scale, but it will shift some things if there is a change in leadership. Market share is rising, slower than Europe, slower than China. They have different levers to pull and make things happen. But if you think about it, 150% growth year over year through May. Majority of investment, just about everything we see in investment is in the BEV manufacturing. And back to what I just finished on, BEVs will change U.S. manufacturing and obviously global manufacturing in many ways. Some I think are obvious when you look at that skateboard chassis, if it really works in volume, and some maybe not as obvious. With that, I absolutely thank you very much for the time today. I hope it was helpful. Obviously, every company throughout the world is looking at exporting or other markets to try to get volume. Even the auto industry, as much as anybody, but all of these industries rely on getting scale quickly. I think one of the things that's intriguing, again, from a researcher standing back and looking at it, is the current Biden administration passion, commitment, almost demanding that things be built here in the United States, and that they be built here in the United States by UAW members, or by union members, unionship members, not just UAW, but other unions. And I think in a perfect world, President Biden would like to have all of these parts built here, none of them imported. We know that's not realistic. The question becomes a couple things. One is, what is that balance? And two is, what do the trade regulations and trade agreements with each country or each region, how do they play into that? And I think you'll see that the Trump administration talked a lot about trade probably didn't get a comprehensive, thoughtful trade policy. The Biden administration is talking about it more and maybe talking about bigger steps to stop some of the international trade, or balance it, maybe is a better word. And I think that's going to be a really, really challenging thing to do. The realities are we don't make a lot of these things in the United States. We haven't for a long time, and some of these are new. The next challenge is that there are trade regulations. So I think that, yes, there is opportunity to import into this country. I do think, though, whether it's Taiwan, China, or Germany, I think you will see there's the potential to see barriers or hurdles put in place to do so at the expense of manufacturing here in North America and specifically the US. I don't know how successful that will be in terms of implementing those regulations, but I do think that is, the Biden administration has stated that is very important to them. It makes sense at volume to produce where you sell. Now that volume question becomes different for truck or for bus manufacturers than it might for a passenger car. But yeah, I think whether or not you're building for European market or you're building for the US market or North American market, or you're building in the Asian market, it makes sense to build things close to where you're selling them. That doesn't mean every piece and every part, but it does mean that there's going to be increased pressure, I think, to do that from both a logistics standpoint, but also a nationalistic standpoint. If you want to sell in our country, you must build in our country, which curiously enough is what the US government said to the Japanese in the mid 80s. And it created a whole new set of Japanese vehicle manufacturing plants in this country. We're still trying to understand. If we think about a vehicle, we think about suppliers like Denso or Borg Warner or Continental in Europe or Bosch in Europe. These are traditional companies. As we look at that last model I talked about, the Foxconn, the rolling chassis or the rolling laptops computer concept, that opens the door to a totally different type of company. And I think when we look at the Chevrolet Bolt, their electric vehicle, you see them using LG and for a lot of the technology, not just the battery, but LG electronics as well. And having a non-traditional automotive supplier become a very important automotive supplier. I think this will happen a lot more going forward. Foxconn may be the best example of it in a sense, but I think the technology companies can do some of these things better than the traditionals. It's what they do. The thing they need to understand, though, is for a vehicle, that vehicle is on the road for 15 to 20 years. You have to be able to make sure that software is kept up to date, when that technology is safe and viable and durable for 15 to 20 years. And I think what the traditionals can learn from the tech companies is speed, is flexibility, is this creativity. What the tech companies must learn from experience or from the traditional suppliers is this isn't like building a little computer. This thing will kill people if you do it wrong. And that is really important. And that convergence is really exciting to watch.